than a black man flying a pursuit airplane in the uniform of the United States of America. Nobody gonna let me fly because I was black, but at least I could be a mechanic. And so when I started to build model airplanes and they worked, the idea began to creep aboard that maybe I could fly too. And so that's the way it grew. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And I had a lot of dreams. I realized most of them. That would have never happened if there hadn't been a war, there hadn't been a 99th Fighter Squadron on Tuskegee. It would have never happened. But it did, and I'm deeply grateful.
Once there was a group of men who didn't know their place. The authorities told them that as black Americans, they had to keep their feet on the ground. More specifically, they told them that flying planes was a thing that a black man could never hope to do. There was a war coming, they said, but they would have to accept that they wouldn't be getting any of the starring roles. The black Americans wouldn't believe them. They had their heads in the air.
This particular day, the normal air show was being performed. This one airplane circled the field, came in, circled the field, flew around. I looked up. I had seen the Spirit of St. Louis on a stamp. The man on the megaphone who was selling tickets was making all kinds of comments. And he said, this airplane does not know how to land at our airport. We're going to send somebody in to lead him in. And I said, I was sitting right down in the box, that's the Spirit of St. Louis. I said it twice. He looked down and he says, with his megaphone, he says, the little colored boy here says, that's the Spirit of St. Louis. And he had a great big laugh of maybe 10,000 people or so. I just stood there, hurt. And the airplane landed, and it was the Spirit of St. Louis. Of course, these people went completely wild. I think they would have destroyed the airplane. They may have injured Lindbergh himself. But they didn't say the little black boy or the little colored boy was right or anything. They didn't do that. No. But I was very well satisfied.
American black boys in the 20s were uncommonly like white boys. They were nuts about airplanes. With aviation a new miracle, they ate, slept, and dreamt flying. By the mid-20s, a few black civilian pilots had managed to become airborne. But at the same time, the American military was making decisions which were intended to keep black America firmly grounded. Between the wars, secret studies took place in this building that had the effect of creating a total setback for aspiring black airmen, an effective ban of which they knew nothing for years. This is the National Army War College near Washington. Here in 1925, senior Army officers were set the task of working out how to deploy black troops in any future conflict. A year later, they had completed a secret study, the use of Negro manpower in war, probably one of the strangest documents ever to come from the military mind.
The Negro is unmoral. The cranial cavity of the Negro is smaller than the white. He is mentally inferior to the white man. The Negro is profoundly superstitious. The Negro is a rank coward in the dark.
The report came to extraordinary conclusions that while the Negro was to bear his share of any future war, his was so inferior a racial type that he could be trusted with only the simplest of tasks, certainly not flying. One black flyer who saw the effect of the War College report at first hand is an old and frail man now. Charles Alfred Anderson, known always as Chief, is 86. He is one of the last living aviation pioneers. Obsessed with flying as a child, he ran away from home for days just to catch sight of a plane rumored to be in the district. He now lives in Tuskegee, Alabama. Despite an illness that lost him 50 pounds in weight last year, he still flies his plane almost every day.
My happiest times has always been flying. Matter of fact, I'm beginning to be very happy now, simply because I'm going out where the airplanes are. Anytime I get in the airplanes and get a chance to fly, then I immediately become very, very happy. And I know I'm going to have a good day.
Today, Chief Anderson is revered at his local airfield, but between the wars, it wasn't that way at all.
Yes, it was difficult for blacks to fly. As a matter of fact, it was impossible. In those days, it was 100% segregation. And they just point blank tell you that we don't take colored people out. No, we don't take you out.
The teenage Anderson got short shrift when he tried to get flying lessons. White instructors at his local airfield laughed when asked. He didn't even get to sit in a plane. His solution was extraordinary. He hustled enough cash from relatives and friends to buy a cheap second-hand plane of his own.
When I got the money to buy the airplane, naturally, I had to learn how to use the airplane. No one would teach me, so I taught myself to fly by observation and whatnot. And if you just take the airplane and taxi it up, run around with it, turn with it and whatnot, you become familiar with the feel of it. And then you watch what other people are doing, and eventually I said, well, I can handle it. So when I decided to solo, I just gave it power and kept on going the way they did.
The self-taught Anderson eventually became so proficient at flying that in a few years he and a friend were the first black Americans to fly the states coast to coast. More than that, he got a license to teach flying. The war was looming, but would he be able to use his new skills in the war effort to teach black Americans to fly?
A gun every 26 minutes. A tank every 12 minutes. A plane every 9 minutes. Free American industry has pledged itself to deliver those tanks and planes and guns on time, ahead of time.
With America rearming at full speed, black people found they were not getting the new good jobs in the munitions factories. Those went mostly to whites. As for the military, that War College report meant that blacks were headed for jobs as stevedores, cookhouse boys, and fodder for the labor battalions. America's black people, though, remained patriotic and ambitious.
We knew the war was coming. You had to be a moron not to know that sooner or later we would be in it. Well, I thought Hitler in Germany was a greater risk to us as black people also than the racism in America. It was a more virulent type. and I was very, very set on doing anything I could to stop it.
In addition to which, many of us saw the war going in to fight as an opportunity to prove to white folks that we were as good as they were and that they were losing something by not having us participate.
The recruiting stations saw a surge in black Americans enlisting. Some decided to challenge the Army over the humble role it had in mind for them.
By this time, the college black man did not see himself in a role of a private in the rear ranks. He wanted an opportunity to serve America, but he wanted to serve America in a capacity that was at least fitting to his predetermined capability.
I went in and told the recruiting sergeant that I wanted to apply for the aviation cadet program. He was astonished, and he looked and he says, "There are no niggers flying no airplanes. Boy, you must be crazy. Get out of here."
C.D. Lucky Lester was turned away by a recruiting sergeant with words that are remembered with anger to this day. The sergeant said, "Look, boy, we don't need no night fighters." But black America was not without friends. One was the wife of the president. Eleanor Roosevelt met Chief Anderson in Alabama in 1940.
And the first thing she said when I was introduced to her was that I always heard that colored people couldn't fly airplanes. But I see you flying all around here. I said, "Oh yes, Ms. Roosevelt, we've been flying for quite a while." So then she decided she's going to take a ride with me. I don't know if I asked her to or not, I'm not sure. And so "I'm going to take a flight with you." And then everybody got all upset about it. And, people who were with her and whatnot. "No, Mrs. Roosevelt, you can't do that." But she was a woman who was very determined to do whatever she wanted to do. So she said, "Come on, let's go." We went over and got an airplane. So when it came down, she said, "Well, I see you can fly all right." And I'm positive that when she went home, I'm sure she said, "Franklin, I flew those boys down there," or whatever she might have called it, "and you're going to have to do something about it."
For all his wife's idealism, President Roosevelt was pragmatic about the role of black men in the military. He did not do very much until he had to, but he was made to change. The way in which new well-paying jobs in the munitions factories were largely going to whites infuriated blacks and led to protest marches. Roosevelt was not slow to appreciate the propaganda value these were to Germany. And there was another small matter. Roosevelt was standing for re-election in the fall of 1940. His opponent was Wendell Willkie, a candidate canny enough to make a particular effort for the black vote. Not long before the election, Roosevelt moved to give black Americans a slightly better deal in the preparation of the awesome war machine. Among the things he did was to sign an order to set up flight training for a strictly limited number of black pilots. The place chosen was Tuskegee, Alabama, where Chief Anderson was already established as a civilian instructor. The Army, forced by politicians to do what it didn't want to do, was only thought to be going through the motions.
So they decided that some of them said, "Well, it's impossible. They're not going to be able to fly. But we'll have an experimental program at Tuskegee to prove one way or another, mostly that it won't work." And that's why we call it Tuskegee Experiment.
The base, tucked away in the deep south, was ostensibly chosen for its good flying weather. For the black cadets, very often the sons of successful middle-class families in the northern cities, crossing the Mason-Dixon line was disturbing.
I didn't have the best feeling about going to the South from New York City. I'd never been south before, but all I had read about treatment in the South had been horrendous.
Lord, I couldn't hear nobody pray.
When my parents heard that I was going to Alabama, they were quite upset. All we'd heard about the South was lynching. And, I don't think they expected to see me again after I went south. I had to go there, and I heard what the South was about. But as I passed through the southern towns and we had to stop to get gas, and the truculent attitudes of the people that we met down there, who had nothing themselves and were nothing actually, it appalled me to think that this was a segment of the nation I'd never been exposed to before.
The town of Tuskegee was probably one of the strictest segregationist towns. I arrived on Christmas Day in 1942 at a small station called Chihua, where I was supposed to be met by a contract bus company, which didn't show up. So I had to walk with my bags to the base, quite a distance. I find on the base that it is a segregated base, beautiful little base, but places for colored and places for white fountains, colored fountains. All this was a complete shock to me.
I knew that we were considered an experiment and we had to prove ourselves. But the one thing about the Tuskegee Airmen, we were all outstanding people. The real problem was the racism that surrounded us. And our view, and I'm fond of saying that black folks are the most hopeful folks in the world, our view is that if we did a good job, white folks would recognize us and stop all this segregation foolishness.
The sight of schools of black air cadets training to handle major weapons shook the local Southern whites. In these buildings now ruined, there was once a fever of activity. Barracks, classrooms, repair sheds, and hangars were hurriedly erected here to cater to the influx of black cadets. The Army appointed Chief Anderson to oversee the preliminary basic training, but sent down white instructors to conduct the more advanced stages. The training was planned to take 9 months from start to finish. But the Army was anxious not to be overrun with pilots which it did not intend to use. To limit entry, it set very high standards, in reality higher than for whites. In consequence, the chosen few were unusually well educated, graduates, even PhDs.
They were uniformly arrogant, self-confident. Generally, they were a different type of people. As I was different from the little group I left in New York City, I ended up in a group that was just like me. If there was a modest and shy retiring man there, I didn't meet him.
The quality of the cadets was further defined by the training. A strict quota system was operated so that the number of qualified black pilots was kept low. Every serious mistake earned you a dreaded pink slip.
The system was 3 pink slips, you're gone. It was completely unfair. I watched people whom I knew could fly get washed out. I dreaded it for other people, although I never received a pink slip.
Well, normally you get a check ride when you get 2 pink slips in your folder. And the clerk had told me that I had 2 pink slips, so perhaps my next ride would be a check ride.
Luke Weathers formed the distinct impression that his instructor was out to eliminate the young pilot by failing him on the technique for an emergency landing.
We took off, and as soon as we got airborne away from the field and began our climb out, he chopped throttle and said forced landing. Well, I had already picked my field out that favored the wind for the forced landing, and I headed for the field. But as soon as I turned and started toward the field, he says, "You can't make it." And I was determined that I was going to make it. He wasn't going to wash me out that easy if this was for the washout. So he tried to push his throttle forward, and I held it back. I was determined that I was going to put that aircraft in that field to make a forced landing and embarrass him. As he tried to push the throttle forward, I kept holding it back until I had the aircraft ready to touch down. And then he hollered, "You can make it, you can make it." And then I pushed the throttle forward. And just as the aircraft took off and got airborne again, we touched the ground and it came right up.
Those eyes were always up on you. It was very easy to become almost paranoid about the fact that you were under scrutiny, very close scrutiny at all times.
We're determined that this thing was going to be a failure of their endeavor, not of ours. We were going to do our best. And we did. We pulled together, we studied at night, and we did everything that was expected of us and a little bit more, because we knew that too many eyes were on us, waiting for failure.
Determined they may have been, but the Army had other plans. It tended to see the Tuskegee Flyers as an experiment in social engineering for which it had little time. There was a war on, after all. The black pilots were expected to fail, but they didn't keep to the script. The man selected to lead them was Benjamin O. Davis, and what a choice he proved to be.
The first time I saw him, I said, there is a typical West Point man. He was straight as an arrow, lean, very sober looking, and he had the air of authority.
A man of strong-willed determination, a disciplinarian.
Hard but fair.
He had to please the blacks, and he had to convince the whites. He was neither white nor black, he was right in the middle.
He could be as nice as he could possibly be and turn around and tear your head off if you did something wrong.
We respected him. There might have been an element of fear.
He had a mind like a steel trap.
You didn't dare question his decisions or his anything, his dress, his mode, what he would stand for, what he wouldn't. You knew that.
He could have led us anywhere under any conditions, and we would have followed.
The character of Benjamin Davis was forged in these mighty buildings, the West Point Military Academy. The furnace was one of extreme prejudice. When he entered the academy, he was only the second black to go there in this century. Davis graduated 35 out of 276 cadets in the class of 1936. He spent 4 years training at West Point as a non-person. If not quite an invisible cadet, then certainly a silent one.
Almost from the first day, he was silenced by the upperclassmen. Silenced in the fact that he had no roommate, he bunked with nobody in the field in his tent. He had to go to dancing classes and dance by himself where everybody else had a dancing partner. There was no social communication. Davis was alone for 4 years. Probably the most humiliating incident in Davis's weekly career was the Sunday morning breakfast at the dining hall at West Point. Every other day in the week, Monday through Saturday, Davis was assigned a table. He knew where he had to sit. But on Sundays, he had to ask permission of the senior person at the table in order to be seated. All 4 years he was there, Davis had to troop the entire hall, asking permission to sit at each table and facing the humiliation of being refused at each table. He would salute. I request permission to be seated at your table, and be denied. Permission denied, and then he'd have to move to the next table. I request permission to join your table, permission denied, and he'd have to move to the next table. This not only takes a great deal of time, but it's costly. Costly in terms of what it does to Davis's ego. It's costly in what it does to Davis's morale. And Davis survived the 4 years because he had a mission, which was to serve the United States as a military officer and to gain a position in aviation. He wanted that badly enough to suffer the indignity and the torment and the pressure of being silenced for 4 years. He's a very tough man.
The airmen were also aided unexpectedly. The station commander was a white Southerner. Everything in his background suggested that he would regard the idea of black pilots as a bit of a farce. But Noel Parrish didn't conform to type.
I flew General Parrish a number of times to meetings in Washington. He'd go up there, and on the flight back, you could almost see the depression in the man. That he went up there and got beaten up, literally, by the top brass about what was going on his base. That it was, I suppose, that it was not such a failure as they had hoped it would be. It is my personal opinion that he ended up with only 1 star because he defied the system. He was a man of immense courage and honesty. I loved the guy.
With a fair-minded station commander and a good leader, the first all-black squadron, named the 99th, was trained and ready for combat by the summer of 1942. But months went by, the men trained and trained, and the call for the 99th to go on active service didn't come.
They were having difficulty with a commander overseas wanting this all-black unit. They didn't want us in England. They didn't want us in the Far East.
They didn't know where to put us. Nobody wanted us. We were unloved, unwanted bastards. And so they kept us in training and training and training. They really didn't know where to deploy us.
Finally, in the summer of 1943, the now exhaustedly trained 99th Squadron was sent on active duty to North Africa. The decision to send them was yet again political rather than military. The Air Force commanders in North Africa did not request the Black Squadron. They got them anyway. Arriving in Tunisia, the 99th found that strict segregation was enforced, even in time of war. They were good enough to die for white Americans, but not to live next to them. The black pilots brought with them black mechanics, black gunnery engineers, black traffic controllers, even black surgeons. They were stationed first on a white base, but they were billeted over on the far side, away from the white air crew. Careful induction into combat flying was known then as crucial to the success of a new squadron. Even highly trained squadrons could not just be thrown into combat, but the black airmen got a novel introduction.
When we arrived, the briefing was all over. And we looked at each other, and they just said, "Y'all boys keep up." And I remember this old redneck just looked at it. He was out of dress and everything. He said, "Y'all boys keep up." So we turned around, went back to our airplane and got aboard. And the armament was being rushed loaded. And we followed them out. And that was my briefing for going into combat on that mission.
Despite being treated by the white flyers as something of a joke, when the black pilots were thrown into action, anticipation was high.
It never occurred to us in combat that we were fighting for a country where we were number 2 or 3 citizens. You more or less rolled with the punches. You accepted your restrictions. We had no time for philosophical questions of race and racism. It was exciting. Dive bombing brings out all the hunter's instincts in a man. You go out, you spot your target, and what's more thrilling than to come down at 300 miles an hour, release your bombs, pull away, and see that you have hit your mark.
The black airmen soon had a baptism of fire, but it came from an unexpected direction. There began to be negative reports about their performance. Senior Air Force officers claimed on one mission that the 99th had broken and scattered when jumped by German fighters. Their commanding officers were brutal in a report, quote, "They have failed to display the aggressiveness and desire for combat that are necessary to a first-class fighting organization." The next officer up the line of command, Brigadier General Edmund A. House, reported to Washington, quote, "The consensus of opinion seems to be that the Negro type has not the proper reflexes to make a first-class fighter pilot." Then the Army Air Force made up its mind. It recommended that the 99th should either be shifted to the low-grade job of looking for submarines off the coast of West Africa, or they should simply be sent home. Davis, now commanding officer of the 99th, had to return to the States to fight for his squadron's life at a special hearing in Washington.
It was very demoralizing for a group of men, and in particular myself and others, who were there laying their lives on the line every day, to feel totally lied about, unappreciated, and certainly still unwanted.
I was on that mission. We did very well. The Germans attacked us, the 8 of us, and we drove them off, and they left. There wasn't a white man in the area to report anything. But we stuck together as we should have. We came home together when the mission was over.
The Washington hearing was adjourned. The flyers of the 99th continued their missions over Italy and Sicily, while their future, heroes or has-beens, was determined. If the black fighter pilots were having a bad time, the American bombers were having a worse one. They were incurring huge losses on long raids into Germany and Romania. The U.S. 15th Air Force considered it was losing bombers because the escorting fighters lacked discipline. Too often, said its general, the fighters left the bombers to go chasing over the skies in pursuit of enemy fighters and personal glory. The escorts could never find their bombers again, and then the enemy could pounce. Benjamin Davis, the black commander, had won the battle for the 99th in his Washington hearing. The Air Force was told by the politicians yet again that the black flyers were to stay flying. Now Davis suddenly saw a real opportunity for his men.
Colonel Davis briefed us over and over that your job is to keep the fighters away from the bombers, that they might do that job. Your job is not to go out and shoot down fighters and become an ace, but your first job is to take care of the bombers, and that, I think, we did quite well.
The black flyers believed they had found their vocation, a task which perfectly suited their talents as a highly disciplined group of flyers who had been together for many months, who had been trained longer than white flyers, and who were headed by an iron leader. Reinforced by 3 more squadrons, the 99th became the 332nd Fighter Group. Still segregated, they were now based at Ramitelli in northern Italy. They were equipped with the Mustang P-51, the best fighter plane of the Second World War. They painted the tails of their Mustangs a bold and brave red. The value of good escort fighters is recalled all too well by the co-pilot of an American bomber, which was also based in Italy.
We had 3 groups escorting us. Generally, there was a group of P-38 Lightnings. We didn't like their escort because they always stayed out so far from us that we couldn't tell if they were friend or foe. They were just too far to do any good if a German fighter would intercept us. Then we had the checker tails, and we thought they were so close in that if we were attacked, the attack would be over before they could intercept. We didn't like the checker tails either. And then there was the red tails. They were always right out there at where we thought they should be, 100 yards out, or maybe less, more or less, but on both sides of us, we were very comfortable with the red tails. We thought they were the best of the fighter escort. We thought they were the best we could get.
Colonel Davis's determination was stay with those bombers. Protect them with your life. Protect them to the ultimate degree. And I do not want any of the 332nd chasing after aircraft for personal victories.
I never considered wandering off, and I'm a pretty independent person. Some of the people that I know who were extremely independent would not take on Colonel Davis.
We had a weaving pattern where we flew over them from one side of the formation to the other side, constantly protecting them at all times, keeping visual contact to above, either side, and below the bombers, so no fighters could really get to them without coming to us first.
One time we were coming back, we were straggling, we were alone, and a single P-51 Red Tail just spotted us and stayed with us till we got all the way back to Italy, for which we were very thankful. When he left us, he dipped his wings and started to take off. And I was on the radio, I said, "Thank you, little brother, we love you." And I don't know what, I'm just imagining this in my own mind. He might have said, "Yeah, you white honky, if you knew we were black, you might not love us." That was just the thought came to my mind after I found out they were black. We had no idea this red tail escort were black. It was the Army's best kept secret. The Army at that time was completely segregated. I spent over 3 years in the Army and I never saw a black soldier. Never saw a black, well, I have to take that back. I did see some doing KP in the kitchen and cleaning latrines, but that's about all I ever saw.
What the Black Flyers were doing was not widely publicized back home in the States. In fact, very few Americans were even aware of their existence. There was one film produced by the U.S. Army Film Department, but it made little difference. It was mainly aimed at black audiences and it painted a partial picture. Called Wings for This Man, the film never mentions that the Black Flyers were kept segregated from the white airmen. The commentary, done with such panache, was by an actor called Ronald Reagan.
Here's the answer to Adolf and Hirohito. Here's the answer to the propaganda of the Japs and Nazis. Here's the answer. Wings for this man. Here's the answer. Wings for these Americans.
The only time the black airmen met their white compatriots was in the air, though there was the odd exception.
Due to the bad weather, the bombers that particular day, after a mission, were forced to land at our base. They could not go down further in southern Italy and land at their base because their field was covered with snow.
We didn't know where we were, but when we landed, got to the end of this metal airstrip, jeep loads of soldiers came up. They were black. Well, we were pretty sure that Hitler didn't have any black troops. We found out they were all black. They took us back to their living area and fed us fresh eggs and steak. What a feast we had. We hadn't seen fresh eggs for months and months. And then they gave us a place to live, a place to sleep, one of the cots that were empty out of their group. Our pilot was Merle D. Brown. He was from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, born and reared in the tradition of the Old South in the 20s and 30s. He didn't like black people. He didn't like Jewish people. And I suppose Merle wouldn't have liked Catholic people either, except that most of our crew were Catholic. He had to like them. He depended on them for our security.
We invited them into our tents and so on, but one of the pilots was from the South, and he said he wasn't going to sleep with any Negroes.
So he didn't for one night. But I saw him next day and asked him where he was staying. He said, "Oh, I've taken one of their beds. It was too damn cold to sleep outside."
And after staying there for 3 days, talking, playing cards, etc., many of them loosened up and said this was really a wonderful experience. There shouldn't be segregation back at home. And when they left with good spirit. But then we found a letter that one of them had written.
I was assigned the job of censoring mail. I opened a letter, and it said, "Dearest darling," now this was just prior to Christmas. Christmas time is approaching, and I hope that God brings an end to this blankety-blank war. It's not bad enough that I'm not at my own base. I'm at a nigger base, eating nigger food and sleeping in nigger beds.
So the black flyers fought side by side with racists in a war against fascists, and the men in their late 70s now still muse over the ironies.
I was asked by a little girl, who must have been about 9. I was speaking at an elementary school. She said, "Well, why would you fight for a country that didn't want you, that hated you, really?" I said, "Well, I was fighting for a country. I lived there. That was my homeland. I was fighting for my home. We had no place else to go. And without our homeland, we had nothing, absolutely nothing."
I did feel it was ironic that we were fighting a fascist country for a country that was, in our own estimation, almost as bad, especially in some sections of the country. You wondered sometimes whether it was worthwhile to do it. But it was always in the back of your mind that, okay, when this is over, they'll change.
At the time, in the hot pulse of war, the men's minds were more occupied with the brutal business of flying and fighting.
Yesterday, I fulfilled one of my ambitions as a combat pilot. I got one airplane. On the last mission, in which I got a probable, I was quite peeved in that the airplane didn't go down. Yesterday, I was quite surprised and quite pleased to see him go down.
I turned right and put up a stone wall of bullets, and the first enemy aircraft flew into it. Then I stopped shooting, and he bailed out. I completed the 360 circle and went directly toward Rome, looking for my leader.
I let him have everything.
How far did you run it?
Oh, he almost dropped on the Vatican. Yeah. I was really surprised and thrilled to see that boy go down. And that was something I was waiting for a long time. Well, I'm red hot now, and first chance I get back, I want to see another one do the same thing.
Kill it? It was a matter of a job. That's what wars are for, to kill people. But I do have a story where one, I think the most civil thing that I did in the war as an individual. We were strafing on a strafing mission in northern Sicily. And then we spread out, every man had a street, 4 blocks with 2 flights. As we came down the street, and I noticed a back alley, and there was a wedding party going on with all the elements of the wedding, including the bridesmaids. And in 1 minute, 1 fleeting second, looked like I flew right into the eyes of the preacher. But I stopped the guns and kicked the airplane around, and I didn't kill anybody. But I almost ran into a metal telephone pole trying to do it. But that was the most noble thing I think I did in the war.
Triumph came in time. The black airmen ended their war acknowledged as a proven success by men who still mattered to them, their commanders. They lost 66 of their number, killed in action, but they never lost one single bomber to enemy fighters. They are believed to have been the only fighter group in the Mediterranean theater with this achievement. At the end of the war in Europe, the 332nd was awarded a Distinguished Unit Citation for particularly heroic deeds on a long raid to Berlin.
When I came back from overseas, I found America just the way it was when I left. It was segregated. It was very self-impressed with itself. We'd won this great war, but basically black troops had been ignored in their contribution, and most people didn't know about the Tuskegee Airmen.
When I returned to the United States, there was no reception in terms of what many of the units and people had received in their hometowns. There was simply no fanfare and no flags and no parades. You were just back.
And as we're getting off the ship coming down the gangplank with our duffel bags, we saw 2 big white signs down there. Oh, they must have been about 6 by 8 feet. One sign said Negro troops on one side and white troops on the other. And it struck me on the way down, a bitterness just bubbled up into me. I said, all of that we've gone through for this. Nothing has changed here. They split us right at the bottom of the gangplank.
I had felt proud until that time because I had won the Distinguished Flying Cross. I had a soldier's medal for saving a life. I had an air medal with some 4 or 5 oak leaf clusters and other ribbons, and that was sort of a letdown to notice that nothing had changed since I left over a year ago.
And later on, an even more embittering experience occurred when I was down at Fort Dix, where German prisoners of war were encamped. They could go anywhere on the base, use any of the BXs, sit anywhere in the theater, and we were still segregated.
And immediately in America, you were simply still questioned by many as to whether the wings that you were wearing here were real and that you were a pilot, that you were an officer, captain, whatever your rank might be, and that those ribbons were earned by you. There were many whites that still did not believe or accept the fact that the black man had gone to war, had fought, and had succeeded in doing so.
For the Black Flyers, the sweet return home left a bitter taste in their mouths. But they did have one major Air Force victory to come. It was possibly their greatest. In July 1948, President Harry S. Truman ordered the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces. The Air Force became the first major public American institution to desegregate. The Black Flyers had blazed a path, after all.
What if I to play?
Okay, man, wait till I get in here. Okay, now when you start flying, this is what you steered by. Just like it, see? You go to the left, you go this way. Go that way, you go down, you go lean forward. You go down, you go up, you pull it back, and it goes up.